Hey guys, welcome back to Q&A with the side of game, or whatever we're calling this Q&A series, and just as an update, or a reminder, you can send your questions, if you have them, to keithballardquestions@gmail.com. This series is intended to be uploaded every Friday at 2:30 p.m. Pacific. That's more or less the setup here. For once, we're going in blind. So far, I've been playing games I've played before on this channel. I mean, not on this channel, but I've played before outside of the Q&A series. This is something along the lines of Zenbound a little bit, I think. It just kind of came into my inbox, and it seemed like a little bit more of a Zen experience and less of a thing I'd want to do commentary over. So I figured this would be a compromise of sorts. Can show you guys the game that I got, another indie game I got codes for. I got so many indie game codes, I don't know what to do with them sometimes, and this one seemed like the kind of thing that would be fitting for this kind of thing, so I threw it in here, so we'll have Lion's gameplay going on in the background while I'm playing this, while I'm answering questions. Let's get started, just to intro the idea of what this is. But I believe the idea is basically you click on a spot and you try to take over the majority of the screen by having your infection spread essentially from where you click, and you need to beat the enemy, which is a pre-located thing. So if you click, I have to click here specifically in a tutorial, it looks like. See, it spreads at an even pace, and you have to beat them in your overall amount of territory had. And that's it. That's the entire thing, is you figure out where to click to win each level. There might be more mechanics eventually, not really sure, but ultimately that's the concept, and you can see why I wouldn't want to, why I'd be interested in showing this, but not necessarily interested in doing game-oriented commentary the entire time. So let's get our first question. Steve Richardson asks, have you ever thought of having an old game slot? Maybe not a whole new slot, but a rotation, or something that that would let you play games like KOTOR, Myst, or Half-Life. There's also a part 2, we'll get to that a bit later, I guess. As far as old games go, I don't think there will ever be a dedicated slot for old games, honestly. Mainly because it's just not necessary. The whole point of my existing slots is to delineate different categories of audience, essentially. I have grown audience in a variety of different directions, and they have different interests from time to time. We started with an emphasis on big RPGs and stuff like that, and over time we spread towards the idea of things more along the lines of, oh, I get to place more than one point? Is that what's going on? Yep. We spread towards puzzle games, obviously, and a few other things, and I have an interest in indie games, whether they do well on the channel or not, so, like, I want to force them into the overall layout, because that's what interests me. So this result of variables leads to me wanting to have a series of time slots for different kinds of content, so I can make sure that we have a reasonable distribution of these categories, because I don't... the main reason, how do I put it, like, the first slot we ever got that was actually a dedicated slot ever, it would arguably be the Patreon slot, because we got the Patreon slot established, and once we had Patreon established, that meant that, this is probably the secret, is to cut them off, so this whole part can be mine. We'll see. I set up a Patreon, and that was a whole thing where it's like, oh, well, I need to be honoring the actual promise I'm making to create this content that I'm saying I'm going to make for these audience members, so there needs to be a dedicated Patreon slot, was the idea. And then after that, there was this idea, like, I needed to... we spread towards the idea of, like, well, not just Patreon, what if there's just certain types of content that I want to be making regularly, and I don't always know if they'll fit? So that's how we started getting towards this puzzle and indie thing, and that was just because the quote-unquote big games, the RPGs and stuff like that, or AAA games, are just so goddamn long these days that they take up... when I start one, they can take up all my time. Like, we're in the middle of I have about 120 episodes of Legend of Zelda, and I have over 100 episodes of Mass Effect Andromeda now, and it's just so much content for a single game, and Berseria and Yakuza were both in, like, the 70 episode territory, and things like that. So, like, it just became a necessity that I make dedicated slots for some of these other categories of content that I want to make, because of the fact that if I didn't, they would get drowned out by these longer experiences. If every AAA game I play on average takes like 10 times as long as the indie games, then like I have to come up with slot rules for my block schedule just to make it so that we can actually have a reasonable layout that always includes a certain distribution of content as opposed to certain things ebbing and flowing. Because what would happen is if I just was stuck in the middle of a bunch of RPGs, that's all I'd be playing for 3 months, and then when there was a drought of that type of content, then suddenly that would disappear and we'd get overflowed with a different type of content. But the idea is that people are subscribed all the time, so you want to be trying to make content for all those types of audience members all the time. That's more or less the idea. But I don't think there is an old game audience, which is not to say that I don't think there's an audience for videos of old games. I'm saying that, like, I don't know, it'd be really depressing if somebody is literally exclusively an old games person, and that's it. Like, that's like, there's no, like, people saying that you are interested in the idea of watching old content is not the same thing as being like, I literally only care about content that's based around games from 1980 to 2002, and nothing past that ever. And then once that's all played, I guess I'll just stop watching forever because there's literally no more content that can be made for the rest of time. That person either doesn't exist or is an exceptionally uncommon exception that isn't reasonable to base content around. So as a result, like, there's no reason I can't make videos for old games, but making a dedicated old game slot would just be such a weird arbitrarity that I don't think deserves a reason to happen, necessarily. Because puzzle and indie game slots are there to fight off the longness of other games taking over my entire schedule, and Patreon's a mandatory thing to fulfill what I'm supposed to be doing for that thing. But a dedicated thing for, like, old games is just arbitrary, because then it's like, oh, what do I start going to, like, the nostalgia critic territory of, like, what counts or doesn't count for that slot, and then, like, what, like, I hold off on playing new games sometimes because it's time to pick the next old game, or there'd be a lot of really weird variables going on there. As far as when I'm gonna play old games and whatnot, really, they get as much chance as everything else does. I have a bunch of older games on my to-do list. I have a very, very extensively long, ridiculous to-do list. And one of these days, we'll get around to some of these games like Myst and stuff like that. It's fun to come up with a lot of long explanations for what's going on, but honestly, a lot of it really does come down to a whim, a moment-to-moment decision as to what I'm going to do on a particular week or a month with my channel. And some of it comes down to trends and things like that, but sometimes it's just a whim. Sometimes I have a brand new game, especially lately with this brand new 6 video slot thing I've got going on now. Nowadays, like, I actually have moments where I'm all like, hey, this is a brand new game, it came out just now, and I have an open slot for it, I should play this. And then I just turned around and played something else. Actually, a decent example of that is the fact that right now I'm playing the Infectious Mind of Dr. Decker. But, like, I have codes for Perception and a few other games that just came out, but I chose Decker because when it was time to pick a game that's what I felt like doing. I'm like, well, that's amusingly strange. That'll be a fun divergence. And so, when the time's right, I'll feel like being like, okay, time to play Myst, or time to play Baldur's Gate. I've got a few months to spare, or something like that. But the time, I don't know, it has to feel right. It's one of those things where it's hard to figure out what's going on sometimes, because it involves getting into my own head and overthinking this whole process, which I tried not to do too much. But at the same time, me not wanting to think about the stuff like leads to me not being sure why I'm not playing Undertale and stuff like that, because I don't have great answers for that. Like, I should have finished Undertale's pacifist run by now. At the time that I was playing Undertale. I was working a full-time job, and I got too busy, and I was taking on this extra intensive process, because the idea of the Undertale thing was that I did a neutral run, then I was going to do a true pacifist run, but true pacifist involves playing a lot of stuff I already did in the neutral run that was going to play out identically, because I only killed one person in my neutral run, but that permanently locks you out of the true pacifist endings and stuff like that. So I was going back and trying to do all that stuff again, and I just didn't have time. Like, I was having to record multiple hours of video to make a single, like, 20-minute video that I would edit down, which also the editing itself takes a bunch of time. Like, so, like, that was a big, complicated process that was quickly becoming too much, and it kind of fell off. But at this point, I quit my full-time job over a year ago, and I should have gone back to Undertale a long time ago, and I keep meaning to, and I keep telling myself I'm going to, but then I keep not quite feeling up to it the moment that it's time to make that kind of decision. And I don't have the best reason as to why, other than just the fact that I haven't. And I don't really have great answers for that stuff, because there just aren't really answers for it. Like, I just don't want... There's just a certain feeling of, like, not wanting to force it, because then the content might suffer. And I think this channel's often best when I'm doing whatever I most feel like doing at a given time and stuff like that, and going on these little whims and weird directions, and every time I make one type of content, it's at the cost of the fact that I can't make another type of content with that time and things like that. By the way, I'm glad I'm doing this for this game for this series and not for a Let's Play, because the fact that the dots change locations every episode would kind of reduce the tactical puzzle-solving dialogue that I'm monologuing I can do if it's kind of like a Zen RNG thing, which it seems to be. And, like, I could go back to Undertale. I almost said Drakengard, but I actually need to get new stuff because my hardware for recording HDCP consoles doesn't work anymore, because Sony updated their HDCP protection, and now I can't record PS3 games via HDMI. Thanks for that. But there's a few other games that I could go back to in a given moment, and there's a lot of games that are heavily requested that I could get around to any moment, and just haven't been. Part of me, I guess, is just waiting for the idea of, like, playing those kinds of games when it feels like my idea, I suppose. And I think a lot of people can relate to this general concept, is just this idea of, like, it's like being told over and over again by your friends to watch this one movie over and over and over again, and they won't shut up about this movie and how great it is, and it's just the best movie ever made. And then but, like, they're so into it that, like, you don't want to disappoint their expectations, and you gotta do exactly what they want to do, but, like, you could potentially enjoy the movie way more if you kind of discovered it yourself and didn't have to be pushed into it by other people so much. And, like, that whole concept, it even applies to recommending YouTube channels and stuff like that. By the way, this game is weirdly pretty for what it does. And so, like, for part of me, like I want to finish Undertale, or I want to play certain older games that I've been saying I'm going to get around to playing one day, but, like, something about the timing, and it just needs to feel right in the moment. For indie games in particular, like, I love that, like, I love the idea that I just decided one afternoon I'm gonna play Scanner Somber today, because that intrigues me today. And then I played Scanner Somber and I marathoned straight through the entire game all the way to the end credits, and then put that video up as a few videos for the next few days, and that was just what I did. And that, I think that's... I enjoy doing my job that way, and it seems like it leads to content people enjoy. And so that's really the only answer I can give about when I'm going to get around to stuff like this, is that hopefully I will. And it'll just have to be like, yes, that's the one I want to do today. It's like the concept of having your quote-unquote list on Netflix and stuff like that. And, like, everyone has their Netflix list, and they often fill it up with all these trash things that are really disposable, easy content that they can just eat up in any given moment. But then they, like, aspire to, like, all these documentaries and stuff like that they think will improve them as a person or something like that, and they put those in there too, and who knows when they'll get around to those, but they're always in that list. And, like, despite your best intentions, you always end up prioritizing certain things over other things in your Netflix list, but then you also, like, eventually get around to certain mixes of stuff, and it's like a combination of want versus desire or something, or need versus, I don't know what I should be comparing there, honestly. But like that's, I guess, what's going on. And I guess you could say that could be solved by making a dedicated slot for that kind of stuff. But then you have like this thing where like, I don't want to be like, okay, today I'm finally getting around to playing Baldur's Gate out of obligation. It can work, but I don't, having another dedicated obligation slot would be a little rough, perhaps. We already have the Patreon slot, which is kind of the obligation slot, but it's just worked out so far. But if I made another slot, if I made more and more restricted slots, we get more and more the territory of like me having put so many restrictions on myself that I essentially have less and less control over my own channel at some point and what I can choose, because I've made so many rules about what I'm allowed to choose that I have less and less choice at some point. I don't know. I don't have the most cohesive answer for this stuff, because it's not stuff that comes with cohesive answers, because it very much is stuff that is just whims and desires of an individual person that you are all that you are all subjected to by choosing to subscribe to this channel. And I just have to make my own calls, and that's kind of just how it goes. And I'm probably just going to cut off that meandering thing. But yeah, hopefully one day I'll get around to playing Myst and KOTOR and Half-Life, because I want to. And I'll just choose when, I suppose. We'll see. Just gonna cut myself off, because I think I'm mostly just gonna repeat myself and meander even more at this point, but that's more— oh my god, that one is a close one. Agonizingly so. Part 2 of the question was, do you play or have you played any RTS or grand strategy game? Example, EU4, I think that's Europa Universalis? Age of Empires, Civilization, if not, why not? Well, on this very channel, I played the game, what was it called? Well, that was a terrible starting point. On this very channel, because it was a Patreon game, I played StarCraft 2. So that was a real-time strategy game. As far as strategy games in general, my first ever online video game experience I ever played— by the way, this is a mind-bending map, which might make it really hard to solve. My first ever online video game playing experience ever was Age of Empires 2: The Age of Kings. I had never ever played it multiplayer or even understood the concept really of multiplayer RTSs, so I had no concept as to what I was getting myself into, and that was a problem, because turns out the experience of playing through this narratively driven single-player campaign is very different from playing a competitive multiplayer real-time strategy game. So like, for me, I was just enjoying these stories about Joan of Arc and Tuknaktikland and all these other words that I was learning, that I was surprising my teachers with as a kid, because they're like, how the hell does this kid know these words? And it's like, through the power of video games. But while I was just enjoying these narrative missions of like making a base and a bunch of troops, and then basically steamrolling the enemy base that was only periodically sending troops at you, but was otherwise largely passive. And that's also how I played StarCraft 2 when I played on this channel, basically, for whenever that was possible, at least, because that's just all I know how to process. But that doesn't work online, so I was so new at online games that I actually had I don't remember what my username was, but I was confused by the idea of usernames and passwords. I didn't know what they were or which one was which necessarily. So my username was E5G3 because I thought that was— I mixed up the username and passwords meanings basically, and because I was like probably 9, and I accidentally made my I was going around online as E5G3, and my password was actually like a name of some kind, which I've long since misremembered and lost to time. But that was an occurrence. Needless to say, I got steamrolled and didn't even understand why I got steamrolled. But I was like just passing from the Stone Age to the Iron Age, or the— whatever the second age is called. It's been a long time, and my base was invaded by an entire army of Imperial Age Crusader, I think they were called. Whatever the knights were called there. Oh, Cavalier, I think it was. It was the mounted armored knights that are just obliterators. So that was a experience that I've pretty much stuck with forever. That's probably stuck with me more or less, is that that steamrolling experience that gets with playing a competitive online game that has a huge learning curve when you haven't gone down that curve, is how completely it's just not a game at some point. Like, it's not a... I'm not criticizing the game. I mean, like, the thing that you experience at that point is, like, not a competitive playing field. And it's one of the most impenetrable types of problematic competitive playing fields, because you don't understand what you did wrong at that point. And that's a very real issue that kind of genre has in any intensive online competitive thing. Latest one definitely is stuff like MOBAs and fighting games. It's just very, very intensive learning curve stuff that is utterly incomprehensible until you're deep into it. And if you haven't been through it, like, it's just not fun. It's just not a type of video game that is fun to play against other people unless you're on an even playing field. And the campaign for these games usually doesn't really set you up for that kind of stuff necessarily, because, like I said, I would just beat the campaign, it would be not that big of a deal, and so there was no way of that. Oh, there was only one dot for this one. Then that would never prepare you for that kind of experience. So that's, I think, what kept me from getting into that genre, because I found that when you beat the campaign, which was the part I enjoyed, I would just move on, basically. But, like, the expectation, I think, is that people are supposed to transition from the campaign to the online multiplayer, and that's what's supposed to hook them for the hundreds and thousands of hours, as opposed to just 10 or 20 hours. And because I don't get hooked by that part of the game, I end up not continuing to play the games, which means I don't get particularly hooked playing more of said game, or its sequels, or related games. I just kind of will hop into one RTS. I'll hop into one RTS once, like, every few years, play through the campaign, and then say goodbye to it forever. Because it's just the hooks that get people to keep playing them long-term don't seem to affect me, because I don't have an interest in the online multiplayer. And that's just... That's the online multiplayer part specifically is both speaks to RTSs, but also just old types of online competitive stuff. Like, I always hear people talk about how, like, you need to play Dota 2 for thousands of hours in order to be properly competitive with it, which means you have to be obsessing over it. And I've almost never had an interest in playing a single game super, super long term. The first game that probably really got its hooks into me at one point was probably Diablo 2 Lords of Destruction expansion. Like, I hopped into that, and it was my more or less first Skinner box dungeon crawling experience, multiplayer experience thing. And, like, I played that for a few months, and then my most long-term, most played competitive online game ever, let's see, I did eventually play Dead or Alive 4 for like a good 6 months, but I played Halo 2 for over a year. And that's more or less it. Those are like the only games. Other than that, my biggest, most time-consuming online experience ever was World of Warcraft, which I played for years. And when I eventually said goodbye to World of Warcraft and I moved back into the experience of constantly just playing new games all the time, I've always found that preferable ever since, and I've never really looked back. I like experiencing a whole bunch of different things, so genres that require heavy investment in order to get the proper experience out of them are oftentimes a hard stop for me. Oh, you earn a bronze by winning one of the levels 3 times in a row. I did not even realize that was a thing. Interesting. Interesting. I guess we'll start doing that then. So, that's really the reason why I'm not particularly into RTSs, and it's the reason I'm not into MOBAs, it's the reason I'm not into collectible online card games like Hearthstone and whatnot. It's just the general reason why I don't have a tendency to play any game where somebody would use the term, with the quotes, the meta. if there's a game where you have the meta, then I probably am not particularly interested in getting into it, because I'd rather pick up this game and play for 20 hours, and then it's over, and then I move on to another game for 30 hours, another game for 15 hours, and so on and so forth, and that's preferable to me. And that's just different people that play different things. There's people who play League of Legends every single goddamn day for a year, forever, and nothing else. My brother plays World of Warcraft a lot, and otherwise just plays online free-to-play games every day, all the time, forever. The Warframes and the League of Legends and stuff like that. And like the people who can do that, but those people end up with different experiences ultimately, because like my brother can't go anywhere near stuff like Dark Souls and stuff like that. Like it's just different spectrums of players. And so that's really the reason, is the boring reason, but I've thought out my boring reason, I suppose, as to why I'm not really into these kinds of genres. I will say that RTS and Grand Strategy are probably some of the ones I'm least interested in doing. I've tried playing a few Grand Strategy games, such as, well, I can't really say such as. I've tried playing Civilization games a few times, and I always get bored. I never finish a playthrough of a single game against bots. And it's just never worked out. And I think the issue there is that I want to have a shared story of some kind with other people. So if I'm gonna play a Grand Strategy game, I think I need to play it in multiplayer mode in order to get the experience I want out of it. And I can just never quite get people around to fully invest in the idea of playing one of those games long term. And I can't help but think that if I ever did manage to get somebody to play it with me, they'd be the type of people that are way, way, way too good at it, to the point where they're probably going to be a bit frustrated with the fact that I kind of don't know what I'm doing, because I've never had the experience that would compel me to play the game long term and enough to get to where they are, because I'm not inherently hooked to it the way that they seem to be. So that's more or less what's going on there, I believe. I find that if I'm going to play something that's a quote-unquote strategy game, I would rather play a game like XCOM or Massive Chalice. I like my turn-based grid. I enjoy like a turn-based grid strategy game that has some sort of meta game built around it, where like you're playing one map at a time, but there's a campaign where your individual matches have canonical wins and losses, and losing isn't a game over, but instead an actual thing that affects the story, because now the thing has to proceed forward with the fact that you lost. Like, that formula does speak to me, and I have been able to get interested in that kind of stuff. And on a similar-ish note, I also, once upon a time, got a decent amount of play hours out of the first Fire Emblem game that they brought to the United States. So that kind of strategy game appeals to me a bit. The more like the ones that's like it's about combat intensiveness in a specific scenario and moment decisions that are relatively tense. I'm not a big and I think part of that's also the fact that it's turn-based. I don't really like the control scheme very much that goes into I don't think I'm a big fan of the control scheme that goes into RTSs and MOBAs, and in fact the two games actually almost have the identical control scheme in a way. I don't like looking down an isometric camera angle, selecting units, and then telling them to do things from a distance. If it's not a game I can constantly pause, like a CRPG. That control scheme feels incredibly awkward to me, and it's probably one of the many things that grows on you because of the many hours you're supposed to invest in that kind of stuff, I suppose. Not to get a silver, I see how it is. That's probably why I haven't played any of those games, really. But what I do like about this turn-based strategy, this turn-based tactic strategy thing, or things that have heavy emphasis on pausing and stuff like that, is that at least people are finding they can make some really interesting experiences out of that kind of concept, which has been showing up with stuff like Invisible Ink, and even a bit of Shadow Tactics, Blades of the Shogun. Like, it doesn't have to be a combat mission necessarily. Like these stealth games and these weird infiltration games. Like I'm interested in seeing how this can be explored mechanically, but I think that may diverge closer to my interest and further from the ones that you may be expressing, ultimately. That may have been a bad choice. Yep. Oh, that was close. Oh, well. So that's more or less what's going on there. People just have to pick interests, and then they invest in those interests, and then people are inclined to play things related to their previous interests because they have an existing idea of whether or not they'll enjoy it and whether or not they'll be capable of understanding its mechanics and so on and so forth, is basically the long and short of it. And I'm probably repeating myself at this point. But yeah, not particularly interested in the genres, but not anti them. Patrick Reed asks, will you be continuing the Darkest Dungeon series, even if it was just one episode a week? I think I'm done with Darkest Dungeon. Probably forever. I always want to say never, especially since I like to finish playthroughs on this channel and stuff like that, but reasonably, I probably should just close the book on it once and for all and just say that it's dead forever, so that people stop holding on to hope, perhaps? That's probably the smart thing to do. So the Darkest Dungeon has a repetition problem. Like, it's not a game I actively dislike, which sets it apart from a lot of the other games I don't finish in a lot of ways. Because I don't actively dislike the game. Instead, there's just an issue where, like, it's a game where you kind of perform the same actions over and over and over again, with minor variations because it's the roguelite sort of genre. And yeah, you can get a certain amount of mileage out of a roguelite type situation, sure, but I feel like I've exhausted a lot of that possibility at this point. In some ways, the Darkest Dungeon series, like by which I mean my playthrough, was kind of a victim of early access, which is something that I'm trying not to repeat ever again. I'm gonna try not to play early access games ever again if it's a game that has like a starting and a middle and an ending, and I would like to finish it. If that kind of stuff comes up again, I'm gonna try not to play an early access game again, because that hurts the series ultimately. Darkest Dungeon especially introduces this idea where like new content would come out and it would incentivize you to start the game over, essentially. And so like by the time we hit the point where the 1.0 version of the game was coming out, I had already put in like 60 episodes at that point, like 30 plus hours. And then I was starting over again. And then I hit like supreme repetition at some point in the playthrough and just couldn't. It got too much. I started finding that I was just saying the same things every episode over and over again. Like my actual commentary was starting to loop because the gameplay loops were becoming so repetitive at some point that like I wasn't even expressing new ideas because I was just performing the same actions over and over again. And it's not a game that really incentivizes experimentation the way that roguelite-ish subgenres of the recent waves tend to incentivize. Because when you play a game like The Binding of Isaac, the entire playthrough is like an hour long or less, and then you do the entire thing in a single run. Hey, I got our first silver, so now I can continue forward. I should keep going for how long I can get, because it's probably going to be a gold later anyway. So I'll keep going until I lose. In The Binding of Isaac, you can experiment with your build for that particular playthrough, and you can figure out what you're going to do with that particular run. And it's a low consequence thing because the moment that playthrough is over, it's over, and there's no major loss for the time that you spent, necessarily. But when you play a game like Darkest Dungeon, they went for an XCOM campaign structure, which means that you're supposed to play one campaign for dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of hours, and every single death is permanent, the game's auto-saving constantly, and you have to live with the consequences of every action you ever make, and it takes hours and hours and hours and hours and hours to grind each individual NPC to get to the rank that it's at so that you can use, well, not NPC, but it takes hours and hours and hours to grind up each individual character, and you prepare them for all this, and you can lose them in an instant from a bad play, which disincentivizes experimentation, which would lead to more lifeblood-like entertainment value in the series, because your experimentation could lead to the death of a character, and then you could spend hours trying to recover from that one time you fooled around a bit, which I find frustrating that that's kind of how the game is built, in a way. And really, the game suffers from being way too long. I found that the original playthrough experience of playing the very first build of the game to be the most enjoyable form of playing the Darkest Dungeon for a number of reasons. One, it was blind, in that I didn't know the game yet, so I was having the fun experience of not knowing what was in store for me, and there was surprises all around, and there was like all those creepy elements of like what's going to happen to me and what danger my characters might be in, and like that was a cool experience that I can never replicate ever again with that particular game. But also, around the time the game felt like it was kind of wearing out its welcome, it ended. It didn't really end, because there was no ending at the time, but the game ran out of content, and so that meant it was time to stop. Nowadays, Darkest Dungeon is a monstrously gargantuan game. They had to make an entirely new mode called Radiant Mode that just served the purpose of making the game have faster progression, essentially. And that mode still has a staggering, nightmarish duration estimation. On their very own page for the game, they say that Radiant Mode will reduce the playthrough completion time from 80 hours to 40 hours. I'm like, oh wow. The fast mode is 40 hours long, you don't say. That's terrifying. Also, am I getting good at this map or what? Because I'm not losing. I don't want to see how long this can go for. So, Radiant Mode is probably a good addition to the game. I will say that if Radiant Mode existed when the game, if I was playing the game for the first time ever in Radiant Mode, then I think the series would have been more likely to have gotten finished in the first place. But that can't ever be done. Because I've already played it for the first time, it's too late, that's spoiled. I've already played over 100 hours of Darkest Dungeon, which, you do the math, like, that's over 50 hours invested already. And it's somewhat tempting to be like, I could start over in Radiant Mode, but by their estimation, they say 40 hours. That would mean that Radiant Mode would take, at minimum, like 80 episodes for me to play through. To play through a new playthrough of Darkest Dungeon in the quote-unquote fast mode. And it's just so much time invested into a game that already wore out its welcome for me and became a grind and became repetitive and became a thing that I was ready to move on from a long time ago. So, ultimately, I think Darkest Dungeon is best left behind forever and treated as like a learning experience of like what kind of how to handle a playthrough and stuff like that, because it shows why it can be a terrible idea to play an early access game. Because if you play the early access game, then you may never fully experience what it was supposed to be because it wore out its welcome before then. And I have learned from that decision because people keep bugging me to play Divinity Original Sin 2. But Divinity Original Sin 2 is only in early access. It's not done yet. And everyone's like, we loved your playthrough with Wander, and we want to see you play the next one now. It's basically what they're saying, and it's like, no, it's not. It's not finished. Wait for it to get finished, and then I can play it when it's out. It's not out yet. It's a beta. But who wants to play? But honestly, like, yeah, why play a beta for a story-driven RPG? Since the RPG, like, the story and the world is kind of the whole point, and like playing some sort of weird incomplete version is just kind of pointless. Aside, because you have no benefit aside from being early, ultimately, unless they somehow, oh, I finally lost. Unless they somehow managed to make it better over time or worse over time or something like that. So I've learned from my mistake, and then I'm avoiding early access in that kind of context, and hopefully that'll be a benefit. This is starting to look like Adam Zombie Smasher with these complex, like almost street-looking layouts. I'm not going to get through a lot of questions with this Q&A video, alright, because I'm spending so much time on some of these. But it's kind of good because these are a lot of these questions, whether I'm using the question I'm actually being asked as sort of a jumping off point, in many ways I'm also expanding into a series of other questions that I get all the time, and so I'm letting those ideas bleed through, so I'm inadvertently answering a lot of other people's questions, I think, even if they're not asking them for this particular series necessarily. Or at least that's my hope. No, I don't think that I would bring back Darkest Dungeon as like a one episode a week thing or a stream thing or anything like that. I've tried that before with when another game was kind of dying for me, which was The Stranger of Sword City. And that just had the issue of like, oh, it's just that Stranger Sword City had the same thing of like, I'm just kind of performing the same actions over and over again and quite literally grinding so that I can gain the ability to play the next pieces of content and stuff like that. And I'm disinclined. I'm trying to just not pick that kind of game in the first place in the future to try to avoid those kinds of cancellations because I don't like having them. But yeah, I tried to do weekly streams for Stranger Sword City for a while, and that didn't ultimately pan out. So that is just not a great idea. It's irregular schedule stuff doesn't fit into my schedule because the whole benefit of my regularity of my schedule is that I can create backlog for that particular schedule so that when other irregular things come up, I have a backlog, and then the videos can still be coming out for the few days where my schedule is technically disrupted. This is, like, I already have enough disruptions, basically, because I have the podcast, I have the D&D playthrough, I have this series now, but this is, I'm making space for this specifically because I have a drive to make this series exist, essentially. And, like, if I have too many pre-scheduled things, it's only going to make everything kind of fall apart the moment I actually have to, like, do something, like, as real-life actions, because I will have, like, no ability to actually find the, like, once I on a regular basis have to go somewhere for the weekend or do this thing and that type thing because social engagements come up and stuff like that, or, you know, you just choose to do things with your life, and I find that the first thing that gets sacrificed every time that kind of stuff disrupts my schedule is the irregular types of things. Right now, the reoccurring thing is that actually the podcast keeps getting sidelined because I keep being gone during the weekend, and we scheduled D&D recordings for Saturdays and podcast recordings for Sundays, and the idea was that we would do those on those days, but then, like, Wander and Bird are both transplants from their homes. They both live in different states, and they don't have tons of social engagements necessarily as far as family and things that they necessarily need to do. So they're better at making time. But Bird is the one of us that has a day job because he works at Amazon, so he's the one that has to have specific pre-scheduled times to be free because he has to work his day job and stuff like that. So that means that he basically is free to do irregular engagements on the weekends primarily. That's when more time exists for doing stuff like this, and that doesn't work necessarily if something irregular happens. So because he has enough time to do minor recordings on a weeknight at a specific narrow time frame, but has actual time for stuff like podcasts and D&D and stuff like that on Saturdays and Sundays, for example. What's been happening lately is that if I'm not there on Saturday or Sunday, we have to pick to either cancel that week's D&D or podcast session, and then we try to make up for it because obviously a lot of people are really into the D&D sessions, so we always end up canceling the podcast, and then we have to transplant the podcast to like a Wednesday or some other day where Wander and I get together perhaps once every other week or something to try to make up for the lack of podcasts lately, to make a weird like smaller cast sub-podcast thing, or I get together with Andrew to do a spoiler cast to try to make that show still exist. But like the moment you have weird once-a-week schedules on top of the schedule of making 6 videos a day, they get really... they keep getting sidelined by their stuff. And so you've got to really want to make the thing if you're gonna... you got to be able to sacrifice the time and really have the drive to make that thing happen if you're going to make it happen in spite of everything. Like, if I didn't have time to make the Q&A video one week, I'd probably just not make it that week and have it come back later because it's not a big priority thing necessarily. But that only works for something indefinite like Q&A, where it's just like, make a video once a week, or maybe not, who cares? But like something like a Let's Play series you're trying to finish, especially a game that's full of constant decisions to make, and you have to make those decisions correctly or there's grand consequences if you screw it up. Like, once a week is probably a little too infrequent for that kind of game because I have to reorient myself every single week as to what I'm doing. But also, like, if even more time passes, then that would just get continually worse. And frankly, the backseat gaming is already pretty intense in that series, where I get a little bitter at times, even uploading videos of Darkest Dungeon and games like that are full of tactical decisions moment to moment because people are really bitchy about it. But ultimately, yeah, a lot of really weird compromises would have to be made in order for Darkest Dungeon to be a weekly series that adds on top of the rest of the schedule. And I would need to specifically have like a drive to make that work that isn't there because the game is so long since burned out and not a game that I'm interested in really playing anymore. So hopefully that has answered that question and several other variables related to that question and given you a big, long, detailed diagram of how parts of my job work, I suppose, and my thought processes. This has been the most meandering of all of the episodes, perhaps. I don't know. I think that every time, though. Every time I finish one of these, because I guess this is a sign to stop, as I just finished this entire an entire playthrough of this particular mode, apparently. Every time I finish one of these, I'm like, that was terrible and meandering, but you guys seem to be liking these, so I must be making a decent point or putting out some kind of information or my thought process on some level consistently, despite the fact that I look at the number of questions asked and versus answered, and I'm like, oh god, that's how far I made it, and that's it? How did I spend that long on that? And stuff like that, and it's because of this kind of, this is essentially a solo podcast, I guess, where I just use the questions as a bouncing off point. But yeah, best of luck to Darkest Dungeon team. It's a good game, and they made an expansion that's probably good too. Radiant mode is probably a much needed rebalance, but as a Let's Player, I don't have infinite patience for performing repetitive actions over and over again and doing commentary over them, so the chance for that playthrough is probably long since flown. It's the type of game I might play in my free time, maybe even on the Vita or something like that, if that kind of time existed, but I don't have a space in my life for that game to fill in my free time, so I won't be playing in that context either. But much enjoyment for everybody, and hey, Wander's playing the new expansion for Darkest Dungeon on his channel right now, so if you want to check that out, then go over to Wanderbot's channel, I suppose, and you can go check that out. I don't know if you'll finish it. Wander has very different philosophies for me than I do with a lot of playthrough stuff. I try very hard to intentionally pick games that I think I will finish, and then I stick to them until they're finished as often as possible, with Darkest Dungeon being a massive exception. And it's definitely the exception that proves the rule, because the list of unfinished games is so specific that it's like burned in my brain sometimes. Stuff like Batman, Arkham Knight, and Drakengard 3, and things like that, and I remember them oftentimes because they stand out to me. Stranger in Sword City and stuff like that. Wanderbot doesn't necessarily finish stuff. He just starts things, and he sticks to stuff oftentimes because there's a huge audience demand, or he's super into it, or something like that. And so I don't know if he'll ultimately finish the expansion for Darkest Dungeon or not, but hey, if you want to check out his playthrough, he's doing one right now. I don't know how much people like the different personalities and whatnot, but that's just putting an option out there. I'm going to focus on other things, and I will continue to confound people by not playing Undertale and Myst until eventually I do. I would love to give a reason. There's not a reason. I can't finish Drakengard because the HTCP problem, where my hardware stopped working, so I need to get new hardware to record PS3 games again, but there just isn't a real reason. I think it's just trepidation or hype, or like just once something's put off for a little bit, it becomes really easy to put off over time, and then a pressure builds up in the background over the idea of going back to it, and it becomes weirdly uncomfortable, and it's easier to just put it off more than it is to go back to the thing that people are asking for. But god damn it, I'll do it at some point. Blah. Thanks for watching, like always. I hope you enjoyed this baffling peek into my brain that's word soup. You can send your questions to keithballardquestions@gmail.com. Not link, but the email address is in the description. You can catch up on previous questions by clicking on the playlist link that should be at the top of the description, which starts with the Minecraft videos and a Q&A I did when I hit, I think, 7,000 subscribers, where I was grinding. That was actually the origin of this idea, I think, is I was grinding in Tales of... I had to grind for Tales of Zestiria, and I decided to answer questions while doing so, and that was, I think, the origin of this entire concept. In fact, in the future, there might be a game that I have to grind for, and I might record one of these episodes for that while I'm at it, maybe. We'll see. Thanks for watching like always, guys, and I'll see you next time. And if you ask a question and I answer it, and you're not satisfied with my answer for some specific reason, you can re-ask the question and like rephrase it specifically for the exact thing that you wanted to get an answer for that I didn't quite get to, or something like that. That's totally fine. Only really works though if you're not happy with the answer because I didn't quite touch on something, not because you just want me to change my mind. I'm probably not going to engage in continued back and forth arguments via the Q&A series. See you guys next time.